My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, a podcast about the American presidents as they are depicted in the movies. Today's movie is 2017's Darkest Hour, which does not feature a president at all, but is about Winston Churchill. I'm Gary Holmes, and I'm here with Jim Robinson, who's learning to smoke cigars and drink brown liquor. Jim, tell the people why we are discussing a movie about a British prime minister.
Well, for the record, Gary, he lived until age 90, so maybe there's something to be said for the brown liquor and the cigars. He was also half American, and his mother was an American, and he was one of the few people in history to be made an honorary American citizen. So those, by the way, of feeble excuses, but he was a great leader. He was one of the most remarkable leaders of the 20th century. And a lot of our podcasts are going to be discussing leadership at the highest levels, and particularly leadership in crisis situations. And that's really what Darkest Hour is all about, isn't it?
Yeah, sure is. So you and I are almost exactly the same age, and I bet we became aware of Churchill at the same time. Let's talk about for a minute what your relationship to Churchill was, when you heard about him, when you learned about him, what you thought about him throughout your life.
Well, I can't say that I've been one of these Churchill groupies, like a lot of friends that I've known have been, where they follow everything and they've read all the biographies, read his own writings, they know all the folklore. But my first memory of him is when he died. I think you and I were just about to turn 11, sorry to give it away, and when he died in January of 1965. And his funeral was televised. It was at the time the largest worldwide television audience in history. And I don't remember actually watching the funeral, but I remember images of it, compared to, say, the JFK funeral, where I specifically remember being glued to the TV set with my family. So the first memory of Churchill for me was his death at age 90 in January of 1965. And then over the years, just through osmosis, he entered the popular culture and the things we learn in school in so many ways. I remember him being imitated on Hogan's Heroes, one of my favorite TV shows from the 60s. There's a great album by the Kinks called Arthur, or The Decline and Fall of the British Empire, that was released in 1969. And there's actually a song on there called Mr. Churchill Says, which uses some of the speeches that we hear in this movie as the lyrics of a song. Not totally complimentary, by the way, but probably the biggest impact of Churchill for someone like myself, and maybe for you too, in our careers as speechwriters for business and for politicians, is has there ever been anyone, except for maybe Lincoln, who's got more great quotes to use in speeches? Now, God knows if they really said all these things. There's been disputes, but with Churchill, there's just so many classic quotes that I've dusted off and stuck in speeches time and time again. And writing for business, the obvious one is when he said, "Some see private enterprise as a predatory tiger to be shot, others as a cow to be milked, but few are those who see it as the sturdy horse pulling the wagon." I mean, you write that for any CEO that's hired you, and it's a gold star. And then there was the never give in, never, never, never give in, which has been used for things ranging from, is a nation going to survive, to are we going to win this little league game, on the ball field. And of course, democracy is the worst form of government known to man, except for all the others. So that's basically my relationship with Winston Churchill, is what a great font of quotes for my speeches over the years. How about you?
Yeah, my first memory is also when he died. I'm pretty sure that I did watch the funeral. I have, you know how you make up these memories. Maybe they're real, maybe they're not. But I have a memory of watching it in the living room, on the TV, and like, oh, who is this guy? I had never heard of him before. A lot of what I've learned about him as a kid was from watching shows about him on TV. And you know, a lot of these were political lessons on how he was correct about German militarism. Um, I have come to consider him the greatest hero of the 20th century, and I still do. I'm actually one of these Churchill. I'm not a Churchill groupie. Like actually haven't read his books, but I've read quite a few of his biographies. You know, he's just such a remarkable person. You know, he was in the public eye for his entire life. You know, he became famous when he was captured by the Boers during the Boer War in the 1890s. And he was a member of the War Cabinet. He was a member of the cabinet in 1908. He was the minister behind the Gallipoli invasion, which they refer to in the movie. He switched parties a couple times. He was a best-selling author, and he was a person that was hugely controversial over 50 years. So, and then he culminates his career by basically arguably saving Western civilization. So, I'm still a big fan. Uh, so let's, before we get into the movie itself, I've written a summary here, and I'm just going to read it for you. So for those of you who haven't seen the movie or haven't seen it recently, here's what it's all about. So it's May 1940, and in the opening thrust of World War II, the Germans are overrunning Europe. In Parliament, the members of the opposition Labour Party are on their feet, furiously denouncing the arch-appeaser Neville Chamberlain and demanding that he resign. Later that night at a cozy white-tie dinner, Chamberlain announces that he will indeed resign. He wants Lord Halifax, another appeaser, to take his place. But Halifax declines. He doesn't think Labour will have him either, and says there's only one alternative. Meanwhile, on the very day that he's about to be offered the top job, Churchill is breaking in a brand new secretary, a Miss Layton. He's so abrupt with her that she flees in tears, but as she's running out the door, a messenger from the palace hands her a telegram from the king. When she brings it in and learns that Churchill will be prime minister, she decides to stay. As watchers of the crown know, the way someone becomes prime minister is that the monarch, in this case, George VI, ask you in person to form a government in his or her name. George asked Churchill to do so reluctantly. Like most of the establishment, he's scared of Churchill, who's a bit of a wild man. Once Churchill finally becomes prime minister, things go from bad to worse. No one can stop the Germans. The British army of 300,000 soldiers is pushed back to Dunkirk and will soon be destroyed. The French are on the verge of collapse. Belgium, Holland, Norway all fall. Lord Halifax wants to negotiate a peace deal with Hitler, which Churchill resists. But fatigued and broken down, he says he'll think about it. Somewhat surprisingly, the king shows up at Churchill's bedroom to tell him he will support whatever he decides, and they have a nice bonding moment. The king tells Churchill to listen to the people, so Churchill takes a ride on the tube where he conducts a small focus group. Everyone tells him to fight on and never, never, never give in, so he doesn't. He orders the evacuation of Dunkirk with small private craft and gives a rousing speech in Parliament in which he promises that the British people will fight them on the beaches, fight them on the landing grounds, fight in the fields and on the streets and in the hills. They shall never surrender. Parliament erupts in cheers, and British policy is set. Britain will fight on alone. So, Jim, what did you think about the movie itself as a cinematic experience overall? Did you like it? What did you like about it, and what did you dislike?
Well, my bottom line is I really liked it. And I would recommend it to anybody that's interested in 20th century history and World War II history. I mean, just to see some of these things we learned about in books, acted out is worth the price of admission. it built on me as I went along. At the very outset, I was a little worried because I thought it was going to be it was like a caricature, his outrageous conduct and behavior and mannerisms. Before I really got into the character, it reminded me almost of a cartoonish kind of portrayal. But that didn't last long, because as the movie went on and we got more toward the actual history of the time and the events in London, as opposed to what he has for breakfast, I started to appreciate it more. So it's not a war film. In other words, there's not big battle scenes, big expensive location shots. It really is the kind of movie that you can envision as a play, being done on stage. And in that regard, it all revolves around Gary Oldman. And it's a remarkable performance. It's even more than remarkable to me when you think about his career, and he's played everyone from Lee Harvey Oswald in JFK, a movie we'll be talking about at some point, to Count Dracula. And so for him to play Winston Churchill, considerably older than Gary Oldman was at the time, and with all that makeup and silicone and whatever it was that made him look like it, was a remarkable performance. So I really enjoyed the film. The ending scenes were just downright moving. Yeah. The tube scene, the speech to I think it was the rump group of his ministers, and then to the entire parliament, using Churchill's actual words. I mean, that was the real climax. It was very emotional, lump in the throat time. So overall, I really enjoyed the film. And I'm anxious to hear what you thought. I've got a few downside notes, but I'll hold those in reserve for a minute.
Okay, so I liked, I've seen the movie before, and I know this is your first time seeing it. I saw it when it first came out. I saw it in the movie theater, and at the time, I had mixed feelings about it. It's like, oh yeah, this is pretty good. But when I watched it the second time, I liked it a lot more. I appreciated it more. I thought the acting was great. I thought it did a good job of evoking his sense of history. My heart in the beginning, my part was like, when they got those scenes of Hitler and the Germans marching across. I mean, I was really like, oh my God, I can't take it. I thought it was great. I liked the speeches. I thought those were the best parts of the movie. You're right. You did more speech writing than I did, but I also did a lot of speech writing, and I liked the process of that. The speeches, I mean, we've grown up with them, so it was great to see them all. I mean, some of the most famous lines in oratory history were in this movie. I tell you, the thing that I didn't like it was what are your reservations?
So the things that I would say were down notes, but not necessarily negatives. I thought the scenes with Mrs. Churchill were kind of gratuitous. I know there was probably an intent to humanize the situation, to bring some of it beyond the realm of large world landscape statecraft. She did a fine job, but I wasn't sure about the overall point of that. The scenes with the secretary worked a little better because it was a way for Churchill to come face to face with the true cost of war, with her brother, right, that died. I thought the scenes with the king were fascinating, but I found his sudden transformation, at least to me it was sudden.
Yeah.
Or maybe I had from about to flee the country to saying, right on, Winnie. Really explained. It wasn't really developed or explained that well. And I thought the one thing that just irked me, although I don't have a solution for it, was when a new date would roll up on screen with kind of a sound effect noise. It was kind of hackneyed in a way. So those would be sort of my downsides. I thought the best, in addition to Oldman, I thought Stephen Delane playing Lord Halifax was the second best actor. And the debates that he had with Churchill and with others were really well done. Chamberlain was good. It was sort of a tragic figure, so he milked that part for the tragedy and pathos
I
of
got
it.
cancer.
Yeah, exactly. And so those would be my downsides. There was a little bit of a done on the cheap quality to the film, because, as I said, it was not a war film with big Spielberg battle scenes, um, and
Well, the most emotional part of the whole movie is the Dunkirk evacuation, which is amazing. I mean, it's a fantastic thing that happened. And at the end, you see very cheesy scene at the end where it's CGI or something. I don't know, where I got all these boats coming out to rescue everyone. And you don't see the rescue, you just see the boats coming out. And it's obviously fake. You can tell it's very cheap there. Yeah, I agree with that.
So I thought, I think other than the actors' salaries, probably the biggest expense for the film was the extras, because there was lots of extras to fill, assuming they were real people and not CGI. But anyway, those would be my sort of complaints, if you will, about it. On the production side,
Yeah,
I've got a few suspicions on the historical side, which we'll get to.
right. One of the I didn't mind the calendar thing, and it was funny. It adds, putting those calendars there and having the date flip adds to the sense of like this is a real historical document. Like it was almost like a documentary. And the one artistic choice that I didn't care for was when he would be Churchill would be driving through the streets and he'd look out the window and see people wearing these Hitler masks. I didn't understand what that was about at all. And in general, this is a problem I have with a lot of history movies. It's a little bit of a dumbing down of a very complicated subject. It seemed to reduce this nationwide debate to four men, Churchill, Chamberlain, Halifax, and the King. And, it was much more complicated than that. I did a little, I read these bios of Churchill, so I went back and reread the section about this, and it was really fascinating what was going on. I mean, the book's so much more interesting than the movie. When the movie starts, you see everyone yelling at Chamberlain to resign, but what you don't see is that there has just been this very dramatic vote where 60 conservatives voted no confidence in Chamberlain to join the Labor side, and it was something like that really doesn't happen. And then this whole business about Chamberlain deciding to resign, it's not something he just sort of decided for himself. I mean, he was kind of forced into it, and there's a lot of back and forth. I mean, this went on for days with meetings after meetings after meetings. So anyway, it's fine. You get the general gist of what happened. But it does feel a little dumbed down, even though there's a lot of talking in the movie. There's hardly any action at all.
Yeah, we're sort of edging our way into the history side of things.
Well, yeah. So let's talk about the accuracy. What did you think about that?
Well, I mean, it was a manipulative movie, and I mean that in a good artistic way. Excuse me. This is going to happen when a movie is about an isolated moment of important decision making by a major historical figure. In other words, it's not a biopic where you get the full sweep of the man's life, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the successes and the mistakes, and all that. You get an isolated, set of days in time and how he acted compared to how others acted. And it's almost easy to forget under that circumstance that the United Kingdom had already declared war on Germany by the time any of the scenes in this movie
Yeah.
took place. Um, and it was England that declared war on Germany, not the other way around. Now, for damn good reason. And it was Chamberlain who was prime minister when the United Kingdom took what today we would consider an extraordinary step. In fact, we don't even do it anymore, which is to actually declare war on somebody. So a lot of stuff had happened. Chamberlain had already realized that he had made grievous errors in underestimating Hitler and in believing some of the promises. And by the way, Chamberlain was not alone in this. Almost everybody, but not Churchill, to his credit, but probably a majority of leaders. Roosevelt, White House, put out a praiseworthy statement when Chamberlain left Munich with the appeasement document. It was not that much of an outlying, outrageous viewpoint to try to make some peace and agreement with Hitler. And Chamberlain did. He was grievously wrong. Churchill was right. But nonetheless, since we see just an isolated moment in time, we don't get that fuller picture.
So I think this is, yeah, I know you were right. Although I've never been able to stand Chamberlain. I mean, the propaganda over the years has totally turned me against him, and I can't stand the guy. But yeah, but we actually have a question that we're going to have to wrestle with when we go forward with these things. It's like, how much are we going to quibble about invented scenes? And there's quite a few things in this movie that did not, for all the documentary type discussion and look, they invented quite a few things, which we can get into. But do we judge the movie on technical accuracy versus emotional and big picture truth? I think from a big picture perspective, this is probably accurate. I mean, these things did happen. I mean, a lot of the dialogue from here is pulled from Churchill's biographies, and this biography that I was reading. I mean, I recognize some of the actual language. So when they did the book, when they did the movie, they relied on the documentary language, documentary record, but they still invented a bunch of stuff.
Well, my favorite scene is probably the most fictitious, which is in the subway in the London Tube.
Right. Exactly.
By all accounts, the things that I read, it did not actually happen. And the writer's defense was, well, he did get around and mixed with the public during the war. And I remember vividly pictures of him touring rubble and seeing average citizens. But the actual scene of him fumbling for the fare for the tube and going into the tube and having a kind of a penultimate, coming to Jesus with average people, by everything I understand, did not happen.
That's ridiculous. I mean, it's totally preposterous that would have happened.
And it's an absolutely great scene.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say that. I was also going to say that was my favorite scene. Yeah.
So, but it does get to a larger truth. And we're going to find this in other movies. I mean, the Nixon biopic comes to mind, where there's a disclaimer slate before the opening credits, where Oliver Stone basically admits, yeah, some things are invented. And indeed, in that movie, some of my favorite scenes didn't actually happen, but they do elicit a true depiction of events and a true depiction of the character of the lead character of Churchill or Nixon or whoever the movie's about. So yeah, I think I think we need to point these things out. And especially if younger people, or if the movie's being shown in history classes. But I basically trust most history teachers to note that when Hollywood takes on a subject, there's going to be some things that aren't literally accurate, but is its take on history accurate? And I think those are sort of two different things.
Yeah. So some of the other things that did not happen that are, I mean, I'll just, I don't know if we're picking nits here, but I'll pick the nits anyway. Obviously the king did not come to Churchill's bedroom to, and I'm with you. I mean, I thought that was a very, the way that switched from, him not liking Churchill to all of a sudden coming and being, having that bonding moment was unexpected. It was surprising because it was so unrealistic. But you know, uh, Miss Layton, didn't start working from him. That character, the character there, she did not work for him at this period, and she didn't have a brother that died, and so she actually is a person, but she didn't. She worked for him like a year later. They didn't work in the underground war rooms. Yeah. By the way, have you ever gone to visit? Did you ever go to London and go to those
I
places?
have, and I recommend it to anybody.
Yeah, it's great.
It's
Yeah,
fascinating. It's a fact. I looked it up to make sure the tours are still,
yeah.
available given, security and COVID and all that. And yes, they are. But I did that many years ago, and it's a very evocative experience, and it's certainly something worth doing.
But there was no reason for them to be down there, right? Because the bombs hadn't started falling yet. So that's a dramatic. But anyway, that's a nit. I guess it does raise your anxiety though to having those strange surroundings. Apparently there wasn't all that. Go ahead.
Well, the other thing about the war rooms is it's so quaint nowadays.
Oh yeah,
because those war rooms and Hitler's bunker would offer absolutely zero protection in any war nowadays.
Yeah, right. Those discussions in the war cabinet are, we're not wasn't as much yelling as Churchill didn't really come close to caving in. He's almost a zombie at one point. He's like, yeah, I'm going to do it, whatever. I don't think that really happened. I don't, as far as I can tell, he didn't really almost cave in on the negotiations. No one heard the speech on the radio because the speech at the end there, which is so inspiring. People would have read about it in the newspaper the next day. This whole business about Chamberlain having this, handkerchief that he's like mopping his brow with to decide whether or not he is, he was not that popular. He wasn't controlling whether the conservatives were going to cheer or not. I didn't like that. But the other thing that's really kind of missing from this is the whole Clement it leaves Labor completely out of the picture. They were in the war cabinet, but you never hear them talking or participating in the discussions or anything. And it's like the backbenchers in general, but Labor in particular, are just not represented. So that's probably the biggest distortion, if even beyond the nitpicks.
Yeah, and Churchill probably was closer to and respected Clement Attlee more than some of the most of the figures on his side of the chamber. And I was reading about the Churchill funeral, and Attlee was still alive and very enfeebled, but attended and was a pallbearer and stumbled going up the steps, almost causing the casket to drop. So he was very, very close, very moved by Churchill. They kept in touch. But yeah, you're right. Labor gets short shrift, in this film.
What do you think the filmmaker is trying to accomplish? What do you think he's up to?
Well, there's several things that I'd like to think he was trying to accomplish. Whether he was or not, I don't know enough about this filmmaker. But one thing that came through is you can be a great leader and literally save a nation or civilization and still have big flaws.
Right.
Personal excesses, big political incorrectnesses, things that today would get you bounced out of politics for good, that it's okay. It's okay. And maybe we should be a little more forgiving of the faults and foibles of our various leaders, whatever side of the aisle they're on, and look at the bigger picture of as to what are their leadership skills and how do they perform in the clutch.
Yeah, I think he's saying that too. Also, I read that he describes himself as a libertarian, which I wonder is a polite way of saying conservative,
It's
and
an acceptable way. In
acceptable
how
way, yeah. Um, it seems to me he's trying to evoke the glory days of Britain, when it stood up to tyranny and saved civilization. This movie came out right after the Brexit vote, and at a time when England was trying to figure out its place in the world. And a movie like this implies that there's something special deep within the British character that allows it to go its own way. So I don't know if it was, I don't know Joe Wright at all. I don't know anything about him, but this whole idea that we're a special people, we can do, like something core within us, the small Britain, is, I think it's so the subtext is that, it's a propaganda movie really for Britain, and we were glorious then, we can be glorious again. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. I hadn't thought of that. Um, the other interesting thing that's brought in, and it's not quite clear where the filmmaker lands, is the is disinformation okay in wartime?
right, yeah,
And this, of course, is a hot issue now with the back and forth on both sides of the Ukraine issue.
right.
Is it okay? Is it justified in the name of instilling confidence, of building support for an all out nation saving effort, to lie or to at least put a gloss on things? And Hitler, Churchill is shown doing that. Hitler did it all the time. Churchill is shown doing that. But did you get a sense of what the verdict was on whether the
Well, I
movie?
think I think that the movie saying, uh don't lie. I think that in the end, Churchill does it for a while, but only for a couple of days. But eventually, I think this is where he's flattering the audience, right? It's like you guys can all take it. Churchill tells you the hard truths. He finally did. That whole speech is like, this is going to be tough. And he tells all the disasters.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
going to meet the enemy in your streets.
Right, right. I mean, that sounds horrifying.
Right.
So I think in the end, he comes down against, at least keeping them in the dark. And apparently, Churchill was during the buildup, the German buildup, he was arguing against what Chamberlain and Stanley Baldwin before him were doing, which was playing down the German threat. And he was saying he was saying at the time that British people can take this. I mean, you got to go to them and make the case to them, and they didn't think that they could, because everyone was so still broken down from what happened during World War I. The other thing that strikes me about this movie is, it shows that the divisions between the ruling class and the regular people are very clear, and yet that's not a problem. I mean, it's interesting. You've got those total upper class people, guys that have been running the show for centuries, and the people down below, they're like, yeah, whatever. I mean, it's almost like the natural order of things, as long as the rulers listen to the people. And it's interesting that the king, who's at the very top, is the one who most understands that you've got to, I mean, he's the one that counsels Churchill to listen to the people, which I'm sure Churchill didn't really need to be told to do. So
Yeah, I think that's true. And also, if in reading about the history, there was quite a contingent of, it's too strong to say that there were Hitler and Nazi lovers, but a contingent of people that thought that there was some kind of a bond with Germany
Hmm.
that didn't exist with the rest of Europe, between England and Germans. And and I think that was, there was a contingent mainly of upper class
Hmm.
British that thought that. Um, there was some of that in the United States. First of all, we had quite a number of German Americans living in the United States at the outbreak of the war. There was some of that in the U.S. too, but our reluctance, I think, dealt more with just our historical isolationism more than any kind of affinity, if you will, with, gee, maybe, what Hitler's trying to do is not so bad. Or, the old, he made the trains run on time kind of nods to him. I did want to bring up, since this is a podcast about presidents,
Yeah.
an American president does appear
Yeah. Right.
momentarily in this movie, and it's kind of an embarrassing, though
Yeah.
probably understandable and historically accurate episode. Do you remember that scene?
Well, I remember it very well. You got Franklin Roosevelt comes on there, and he's all cheerful, and a good imitation, I thought. But yeah, it's really embarrassing because I think it probably is accurate, and you know, supposedly Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt had a fantastic relationship. But uh, so yeah, it is embarrassing for us. This whole idea about, well, you bring the horses that we can't give you this material, but you know, if you can, we'll bring it up to the border, up to Canada, and you have to bring these horses over to get it. I mean, that sounds kind of ridiculous.
Right, but it was. I know that Roosevelt, and by the way, he signed the law that, prohibited
Yeah.
the Neutrality Act. But I understand a lot of those sentiments, and and he was looking for workarounds, definitely,
Yeah.
to the law that restricted him from supplying the British. He very much wanted to do that. Um, and the Lend Lease scheme that they eventually settled on, which was deeply opposed by, for example, Ambassador Kennedy and Americans. Um, and he did try to work that out, but his appearance, given what Churchill was facing, and then you're right, speaking of sort of that upper class, twitty kind of, cheerio voice of Roosevelt on the phone, trying to say, keep your British chin up, Winston, and it did come across as ridiculous, but maybe unfairly so.
Yeah, I think so too, considering how Roosevelt was trying to help Churchill and with a run with the end run. So I agree with you. I thought it was pretty unfair. Um but the British have a way of portraying American presidents as, kind of buffoons in general. I mean, there's a movie that I literally hate, and we will never discuss here, Love Actually, where you know, uh, the American president comes to visit England, and he's a buffoon and a womanizer, and he hits on the secretary, uh, the prime minister's secretary. So, I don't think and if you've ever watched, I know you don't watch The Crown, but it's the same thing. They always show the American presidents as kind of idiots. So I it's not surprising.
Well, if this movie broadened out the look at Churchill's wartime leadership,
Yeah.
as I was referencing before, it would not all be slam dunk.
Right. Right.
A lot of his subsequent actions, reactions, delaying tactics, priorities are very much subject to questioning. He talked everyone to death Eisenhower ended up being the one that was assigned to go up to Chequers to listen to all night Churchill monologues, booze infused. And he really didn't want D-Day to happen. If you really read the full record and read between the lines, he was satisfied with air power, just beating the Germans into submission. Was much more concerned about preserving elements of the British Empire. And that was his priority, especially, through the Mediterranean and protecting the British interests in the Middle East. And so, again, this movie isolates an episode in which Churchill was a legitimate hero, absolute hero, was absolutely right, with his antagonist being wrong. But the full picture is,
yeah, I mean, it is totally hero worship. Well, there were some, you talked about some of the flaws they show, but they're minor flaws, really, consider, and they're almost like, well, I mean, it's personal, like he yells at the secretary and he maybe drinks too much, and but those are not as bad of flaws as the strategic mistakes he made during the prosecution of the war. Yeah. So, but the thing is, it's like, and I think that you and I appreciate this because it's the power of the words, the speeches, that is his greatest leadership capacity. Because I mean, I think we both believe in persuasion being what leadership is all about. It's not really, I mean, you have to be right on the facts, but more important than that, you have to be able to persuade people to do it. And again, not to get into public, but this is what Zelensky has accomplished in Ukraine, is just through, he roused his people to stand up in a way that that like Churchill did. And well, let's see. So what are your, so we just talked about language. What do you think what are your favorite best lines in the movie?
Well, you can't beat the lines that were actually real
In the speeches. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So to me, that's a slam dunk.
Right.
I mean, you just can't beat it. I mean, and no one has, probably, maybe in human history. And I'm with you on that. He was just a master at it, and he did not have the full weight of the electronics, as you mentioned. The speech wasn't even broadcast, and I guess some of the speeches he would record later and they would get released, but I believe that the one to Parliament wasn't until maybe after the war. And
I think I read that it was that speech was recorded in 1949, which is almost 10 years later.
So it's always interesting to me how a leader or celebrity, we've talked in the past a lot about Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah.
How do these people, before the age of all the electronics and television and radio existed, but how do these people become iconic figures in the popular imagination without all the aids that exist nowadays for people to do that?
Well, Churchill had the radio, but newspapers, I think, were the social media of the day, right? People would read 3 or 4 newspapers, and they'd come out in the morning, they'd come out in the afternoon. So, but I agree with you. It just seems impossible well, we've talked about it with the Beatles. Like, how did the Beatles become so world famous in just a snap of a finger? It happens, I guess.
Right.
Or if you want to even go back further to Martin Luther, I mean, how did he in the 1500s change the world? Just how did all that circulate? Through because through some printed pamphlets and stuff. So I don't know. It's interesting how people can change the world just through their own words. So
Right.
so yes, I agree with the speeches are the best. I thought my favorite line, aside from the speeches, was the very last line where someone asks um, Halifax, what just happened? And he says he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. And
Yes, that was a
that
great one.
that's a great, and the other favorite lines I think are actually Churchill. I believe they are both Churchill quotes, have been attributed to him. You cannot not negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. And something he said about Clement Attlee, he's a sheep in sheep's clothing. So let it come down. Favorite scenes?
Well, as I mentioned, the one in the tube
Yeah,
was the favorite, and
same
then
here.
I actually loved the scene, the sort of warm-up speech before the parliamentary scene. Now, who was that before his broader group of ministers? Who was that before? Do you know what I'm?
So that, as I understood it, that was so he had there was a cabinet and I guess a sub cabinet and then the war cabinet. The war cabinet was these five people. But I think that the group that he was talking to was like the sub cabinet of like the senior, yeah, basically the other ministers who were not at the top, but they were not the full parliament. So they were, yeah,
Well, that was really good, and with his speech, and then with the close-ups of several of the figures saying "never,"
right.
and I thought it
The
was,
word never appears all over the place.
right. Yeah, so those were my favorite scenes. As I mentioned, I thought I struggled a little bit with the Lady Churchill scenes, not because they were bad, but because sort of a "what's the point" reaction. I
Yeah.
I snickered at the scene of his when he was popping the champagne upon moving into number 10, and he had his, I guess, his children, and there was a very dismissive sort of like look on his son's face, at one very fleeting moment, about, how am I ever going to live up to this, to my father, like.
I don't know what it says about me, but my favorite scenes were the ones that were completely manufactured and false. So like the Hollywood scenes, the subway, the King's visit, I thought was was good when they were just talking man to man. When Miss Layton is learning about Calais, and tells him that basically her brother didn't make it, and just the camera lingers on her. She's not crying, she's not just very stoic, and she's embodying this stiff upper lipness of the British, and it really lingers for a long time, and it's like I felt the emotion of that moment.
Yeah, I liked that scene, and I liked how, and this speaks to what you were saying about the classism, how Winston just sort of stared at her for a while, when she was reporting this. And she, like he was connecting with her, but he wasn't going to do it in words.
Yeah.
And then she almost irreverently said, like, what? Like, what are you staring at? She didn't exactly say that, but that was her demeanor. And I thought that was very good. I thought that was good. So
Um,
what
and
grade was?
also there was just one scene that I thought was so funny. It just went by in a second, where when Churchill comes in and he kisses the king's hand, and the king turns around and wipes it on his back. Did you notice that? So
Yes.
like yeah. Well,
And how he
you're a
backs out.
germaphobe. I'm sure you would have appreciated that.
How he backs out of the room, but you can tell he really didn't want to back
Yeah.
out. That he was worried maybe about falling over. He just wanted to do what normal people do, which was you turn around and exit the room.
That must be so weird. I mean, I'm sure you haven't watched The Crown, but you see this scene all the time where the prime minister after prime minister comes in and sees Elizabeth, and it's always awkward. Um, Best and worst impersonations of a historical figure. I mean, you already
Well,
mentioned Gary Oldman, so that's great.
right. And then I think the Lord Halifax. I don't really know what the historical figures are supposed to look and sound
Right,
like, except Chamberlain,
right.
and that's an easy one.
Yeah.
Um, but I thought Stephen Delane as Lord Halifax was really good in terms of acting. Um, I don't really have any worse ones because I don't know enough about how
Right.
they're supposed to look.
Well, let's talk. I mean, let's talk about Gary Oldman for a second, because he really was good, and he won the Academy Award, and it was a slam dunk that year. Everyone knew he was going to get it. And he had to put on all that makeup, and supposedly he got nicotine poisoning from all those cigars. I barely knew who he was before this, and if you go and look at his Wikipedia page, it says he's one of the highest grossing actors of all time, and that's because he played Inspector Gordon in 3 Batman movies, and he played Sirius Black, a major character in 4 Harry Potter movies. And as you mentioned, he was Lee Harvey Oswald, and he's just been in a ton of movies. So he's one of these British actors that is always working, in a million movies that we've never heard of and playing in plays and stuff.
But I would never in a million years recognize him on the street.
Right. I absolutely. I don't know. I
Not
have
a
no idea.
known celebrity, at least in America.
Right. This is a whole and Lily James, who I know you don't know, I assume you don't know,
No.
played Miss Layton. She was famous for being the cousin on Downton Abbey. She was the girlfriend. I assume you saw this movie in Yesterday, that Beatles movie.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so she was the girlfriend there. She was in Mamma Mia. I don't know Miss Layton at all, but I'm assuming that she was older and not quite as pretty as Lily James. I also agree with you that I think that the guy that played Chamberlain was good. And I thought the guy that played the king was very good too. That George VI has been portrayed by a bunch of different people, and Colin Firth, played him in the King's Speech, and didn't look at all like him. He actually looks like the photos you see of the king. And I, I know you don't like the scenes with Churchill's wife, but I thought Kristen Scott Thomas, who plays her, was pretty good. It really looked like her, at least. She was in 4 Weddings and a Funeral. She's another one of these British actresses that is over there and just is in a million things. Now I did like. I don't know anything about uh, Halifax, but I thought that he was probably pretty good. He was certainly an affecting guy. He looks like he was like smirking the entire time, but very dour person. He's he's pretty interesting character. I went and looked up some because I've heard about him all this time. He's a he's another Halifax himself is an interesting figure, typically British, and it just goes to show you how William Manchester called these guys an oligarchy, and it's true. I mean, Halifax was a lord. He actually was the 4th son, and his 3 brothers died. So he became. But his real name is Edward Wood. But Ed Wood. I mean, could there be a more dull name?
Right.
But he gets called Halifax. But all these guys, they went to college together. They went to they went to Eton together. Churchill's father and Chamberlain's father were enemies or political enemies in the Gladstone, when Gladstone and Disraeli were prime minister. I mean, so this goes down generation after generation of so it's kind of interesting. But I thought and the reason is that and I didn't realize this until I looked it up. Halifax is never down there with Chamberlain, right? He's never sitting next to him. That's because he's in the House of Lords. He can't be down in the Commons, and that's one of the reasons he didn't want to become prime minister, is because usually the prime minister is the leader of the opposition party or leader of the party in the Commons. So, I mean, I'm sure they could have gotten around that technically, but anyway.
Yeah, I thought, again, I think that Halifax was a good foil
Yeah,
and not a dumb idiot foil, but
right.
smart enough to make the debate, give the debate some weight and some realism. And again, I would just point out, and I'm on Churchill's side on this. Absolutely. But the best argument I heard for not, for stringing Germany along and pretending to negotiate.
Right.
Britain was not ready to fight a war yet. They were trying to buy time, but that a lot of things were being done. The country was rearming before Churchill ever set foot in number 10. A peacetime draft had been instituted, again, under Chamberlain. That's a big step, and was a big step in the United States when that was done in the late 30s. It's not all black and white, except in the big picture, it's very clear who was right and who was wrong.
Right. Right. A fun fact about Lord Halifax is that his great grandfather was Earl Grey, who was famous for tea, and he was also a prime minister. So Halifax was the great grandson of a prime minister. Okay, so if you were a history teacher in high school, would you assign this movie to your class?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that a lot of the kids probably be bored.
Yeah. The thing about the movie
I like
is,
it very much. I would warn the students about, to what a Hollywood depiction is all about. But there was not a lot of great location shots, and as we mentioned, big battlefield scenes and action. But yes,
yeah, I would recommend it too. And they might not I agree with you actually that they might be bored because you have to have a certain understanding of how the British government works, because there's a lot of political back and forth. And I kind of complained that it was dumbed down, but it probably wasn't dumbed down enough for high school students, because there's a lot, like, you're right, like war cabinet and the sub cabinet, and why are they yelling at each other in the commons like that? And so yeah, but I would do it. So if you're a history professor, what grade would you give the movie?
A-.
Okay, agreed. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very good movie. A must see for anyone interested in this era and this period and in Churchill. Not without some flaws.
Have you seen a lot of Churchill stuff on screen before?
No, I haven't really. I've read a lot tangentially about Churchill in all the books I've been reading about American presidents of the era,
Right.
and the generals of World War II and such.
Well, he's
How
been
about
played by quite a few. I mean, he's a big character. I mean, he's a little bit like another president we'll talk about, Richard Nixon, played by a lot of different characters, a lot of different actors. John Lithgow played him in The Crown, Robert Hardy in The Wilderness Years, Albert Finney in The Gathering Storm, Brian Gleason in Into the Storm. So, I mean, it goes on and on and on, because he's a very dramatic. It's easy to, it's so easy to character to imitate him, because he's got these big gestures and big ways of talking. And so, all right, so before we close out, Have any recommendations of anything related to the movie or presidents in general?
Well, I'd mention two books that I've read, and I can't say I've read, in recent weeks, but in recent months that I would mention. The first is, as you know, I'm a big fan of Eisenhower. I wish he could run for president in 2024. He would be about in the same age group as the candidates that have run so far. But there's a lot of books about Eisenhower, some focusing on just his presidency, but one that covers the full sweep of his experiences in leadership in World War II and his presidency is Gene Edward Smith's Eisenhower in War and Peace. If somebody's looking to read a jack of all trades biography of Eisenhower, that would be one I'd recommend. And there's a lot about his interactions and relationship with Churchill and with Roosevelt, and between Roosevelt and Churchill, and the decisions regarding D-Day and how Churchill played into that, and the delaying tactics, if you will. So that would be one. And the second one would be the first volume of a 2-volume biography of JFK. The second volume isn't out yet. I'm anxiously looking forward to it. But it's called JFK Coming of Age in the American Century. And it's by Frederick Logeval. I think I'm pronouncing that right. L as in Larry, Ogeval. And it covers JFK from birth, really before birth, because it gets into the family history.
Yeah.
Up to 1956, his failed effort to become the vice presidential nominee. And there is a lot in there about Ambassador Kennedy, Joe Kennedy, his father, his relationship with the British politicians, because he was ambassador to the court of St. James. JFK, a young JFK, was over there. He was the only Kennedy that liked Churchill and didn't like Chamberlain. And, Joe Sr. and Jr. were basically appeasers at best.
Mm-hmm.
And Kennedy, JFK, as a student, toured Nazi Germany, the opening days of the Nazis, was on the scene during all of these debates before his father got recalled back home in some kind of disgrace. And so I really recommend that, not only because of all the insights about JFK, but also because what we've talked about today.
Okay.
It's not a fawning biography. It's not a love feast like so many of the JFK books are. It's warts and all, but it's not a scandal sheet either. It's a good middle of the road depiction.
I would recommend the Churchill biography, The Last Lion by William Manchester. You remember William Manchester? The first time we ever heard about William Manchester, when he wrote that book about the JFK's assassination. It was a huge scandal because Jackie was upset because he'd included a bunch of stuff in there that she didn't think was appropriate.
Well, it was graphic depictions of the top of the president's head being blown off and things like that. And it began as an authorized biography,
right?
And ended up in court.
Yeah. Anyway, he's actually he's written this multi-volume biography of Churchill, which is, I mean, he's an American, I think. And the biography is great. And I'm just going to read from the penultimate paragraph. So it says, the appeasers had been powerful. They had controlled the Times and the BBC. They had been largely drawn from the upper classes, and their betrayal of England's greatness would be neither forgiven nor forgotten by those who, gulled by the mystique of England's class system, had believed in it as Englishmen had believed for generations that public school boys governed best. The appeasers destroyed oligarchic rule, which, though levelers may protest, had been governed well. If ever men betrayed their class, these were they. So it's like very vivid writing, and and again, this is where I got a little bit of the detail about all the shenanigans that were going on before Churchill, before the Chamberlain government fell. But anyone's interested in Churchill, that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, I've heard of that, and now you've now gotten me interested. I think I will, as soon as I finish yeah, there it is. Whoops. As soon as I finish I'm on volume 3 now of the 3-volume Thatcher authorized biography.
Okay. Well, Churchill is probably the most amazing figure. I mean, he might not be the most important. We can argue about who was more important. Like you could make the case that Lenin was the most important figure of the 20th century, but he's really the most amazing figure who dominated really the first half, because he was always there. He's always like Nixon. Nixon was always there for decades and decades and decades, and then he finally became prime minister, and he had so many exploits. What?
Yeah, he even basically defined and gave words to the Cold War, the Iron Curtain.
Right. Going up to even when he wasn't prime minister, and then he was defeated immediately after the war.
Right.
Go figure.
Thanks for lately is what have you done for me lately is the motto of democracy. It should be.
Exactly. Thanks for winning the war. Take a hike. All right. Well, thanks, Jim. And we'll be back next time with another fascinating movie about the next time we'll be talking about the American presidents. So bye-bye.
All right. Take care.